Welcome to Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah. This is the podcast where we explore the people and stories that make up the tech and venture ecosystem. Don't forget to subscribe, like, rate, and share the podcast because it really helps us get the word out to more people who are curious about understanding even more about the world of venture capital. This season of Nothing Ventured is sponsored by Odin. Odin helps angels, VCs, and founders to raise and deploy capital seamlessly. You can structure your SPVs and now run your funds, handle capital calls, portfolio management more smoothly and easily in one place. Founders use Odin to raise their entire round in a few clicks by simply sending investors a link and receiving investments immediately. Odin works with over 5,000 investors and over 150 emerging fund managers and angel syndicates globally. Head to joinodin.com to learn more. That's joinodin.com. Hello and welcome to this episode of Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah. In today's episode, I was super excited to have with me in the studio Mark Kleyner. Mark is the co-founder of Dream VC, an entrepreneur himself, an ecosystem builder and early stage investor in emerging markets. Having co-founded, worked in and advised multiple startups and funds, he now drives his value through Dream VC, an investor accelerator for Africa. In today's episode, we talked about building capacity in the venture ecosystem in Africa, how we as Europeans or Americans can educate ourselves about what's happening in the African continent, what are the challenges that startups and VCs face in Africa, and why Mark and his co-founder felt the need to launch Dream VC after having found that other VCs weren't really willing to pass that baton on. Let's get straight into it. Hello and welcome to the Nothing Ventured podcast with me, Aarish Shah. Today it is really great to have Mark Kleyner in the studio with me. If you haven't already caught up on Mark's primary episode, do check it out. We'll drop a link in the show notes. In the meantime, we're going to get straight into some of the detail that Mark has kindly come here to talk to us about. But great to have you here with me again today.
Thanks for having me, Aarish.
Amazing. Let's dive straight in, right? So you took a pretty roundabout route to doing what you're doing today, right? You're of Russian and Ukrainian descent, which is a podcast in and of itself, I think. You've lived and worked in the UK, Southeast Asia, Nigeria, and plenty more. So can you give us the whistle-stop kind of tour of the biggest challenges you face in each of those locations, how they differ from each other, I guess?
Sure. Well, I think I'll mention it as a challenge and also a bit of an opportunity in itself, because actually I think something people don't necessarily consider is that I think people who have a certain interest in an emerging market, any emerging market anywhere around the world, Southeast Asia, South Asia, LATAM, or even Eastern Europe, often build a certain resilience which can be useful in another emerging market as well. And I think for me, growing up and seeing my father work in a mostly international or foreign business, trying to somehow work around the dynamics of working in an emerging economy with the usual issues, political, private sector, and otherwise, trying to balance all the interests of stakeholders around them, it showed me, one, how you should be careful, when to be careful and when not to be, and also what the opportunity is when you combine local expertise with international expertise in a structured context. And I've seen so many people do that really well. So I think for me, probably the biggest advantage or privilege I had was the ability to travel. I've traveled a lot, back when I was a kid, traveling with my family consistently, then growing up, traveling personal interests, just going to new places, getting an idea of what the working culture was like, what people were like, what their attitude to just day-to-day life was like. And I think that shaped a certain character that made it easy for me to then, take myself and transpond myself almost to a different place altogether, where I then can thrive in that ecosystem. So being and experiencing a bit of the consumer culture in Southeast Asia, experiencing a lot of the really hard work ethic you tend to see in East Coast US, especially seeing the more structured, I think more precedential-based working environment in the UK, and then seeing just the absolute grit, the idea that you're going to get something done despite everything going against you, terrible infrastructure, terrible bureaucracy,
just chaos
everywhere, which you tend to see in Eastern Europe and you tend to see in West Africa. I think that comparison, it just made me almost immune to the fact that when something doesn't work, I think, okay, well, it doesn't work. How can we go around it? Not just cripple down and say, now everything is lost.
It's it's one of these things. I mean, as someone who grew up traveling a huge amount, has lived in several different countries, including, places like Papua New Guinea, and being of African descent myself, or at least of African birth, and my family's been out there for many, many years. I don't think you can underplay how much you can learn from those sort of experiences. Like I describe my time in Papua New Guinea as very much an MBA by experience. Like I do not think I'd be able to do what I do today without having spent 10 years basically busting my gut out there. And I think the way I always describe it, right, is from my experiences, if I am able to run a manufacturing company in a third world country or a developing economy like Papua New Guinea, third world is obviously the wrong phrase, so apologies for having used it there, but a developing economy like Papua New Guinea, where you've got issues around shipping and getting goods cleared off the dock, you've got huge amounts of corruption and nepotism and all those sort of issues, right? If you can figure out how to work that stuff out and still run a decent business, like running a SaaS business is not too difficult, right? And out of all of those sort of areas that you've lived and worked and the sort of challenges you face, what would you consider to have been like the one that really sort of struck you as being very, like, not only educational and chat, but really tested your kind of spirit, I guess?
It's a hard question. I think probably the biggest was the contrast. So maybe the contrast between somewhere like the US and perhaps Nigeria or Kenya, or maybe the contrast between seeing what's possible in the UK and in Russia, for example. So it's just something where you see both the shift of the socioeconomic dynamic, but also a shift of the mindset. So, for example, just speaking from experience, you go to New York and you go to Moscow, and it might seem quite similar. You're going from one giant metropolis that's very centralized to another giant metropolis that's very centralized. People in both cases are very much about work. People are very focused. They're always in a rush. People always seem like they're going from point A to point B, and they don't want to stop and chat. But that's not London necessarily. That's quite different from the European metropolis vibe. And that's completely different from somewhere like Lagos or Cairo, for example, which are also metropolises, but are almost on the other end of the spectrum. It's just absolute chaos, wherever you go.
They're sort of randomized streets that have just kind of come together in this big sprawling mass.
Sure.
Right? This season of Nothing Ventured is proudly sponsored by Emerge One. Emerge One provides fractional CFO support to venture-backed tech startups and scale-ups. They work with businesses from seed to Series B that have been backed by some of the UK, US, and Europe's best venture capital funds. They provide support from capital allocation and management, KPIs and reporting, fundraising support, financial modeling, investor relations, and investor management. Come check them out at emergeone.co.uk when you're scaling fast and have need of a CFO.
And I feel like it impacts the dynamic of how people get around life and what they kind of treat as a status quo as well. I think in the same way as maybe an American living in anywhere outside of New York really would feel confused by the fact that you have trains and a metro system in European cities or in parts of Asia. Someone coming from Asia, for example, to an American city where everyone seems to drive would think this is so inefficient.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that one is better or one is worse. It's just
different.
kind of different, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, that sort of analogy strikes me as like, really pertinent whenever you have Americans come over to London, used to sort of the grid system, let's say, and they come to London and everything is like, you need Google Maps to do anything. Like there is no point of reference. It's very hard to get around if you don't know what you're doing. It causes you to, I think, have to think outside of your comfort zone. And I think that's always a good thing. So if you consider the African market for startups, what are the specific challenges faced on the continent? Presumably the usual sort of access to funding, access to talent, education, etc. But, if you put it on your dream VC lens, right, which is all about bringing the foundational level of investor support sort of up to scratch, if I can put it that way, in and across Africa, not only in Africa, but outside of Africa, but focused on Africa. What are the challenges that you see both for startups, I guess, and also for those investors?
Well, I think it would be a miss for me not to make the usual correction that Africa is many markets.
Yeah.
You know, 50 plus differences, hundreds of regulations, and a completely nightmarish set of markets that actually you try to group together. I think even trying to group them by language is quite complicated because most Arabophone countries have different laws, most Francophone countries as well. Even not all the English-speaking countries would necessarily abide by a similar legal system. I think what for us has been an issue is that the growth in sentiment or the growth of adoption of a mentality that you want to see more African people or African descent, for example, investing in Africa has been phenomenal. So that's a meteoric rise, and it's kind of parallel to what we see as a meteoric rise in, for example, remittance payments back from African professionals abroad, which has continued to grow year on year despite COVID and everything else. But at the same time, we don't see that meteoric rise in infrastructure. There's a meteoric rise in conferences, a meteoric rise in talks, a meteoric rise in discussions on what can be done, but it still requires a can-do attitude of actually implementing that. And I think something that we're increasingly seeing is that it's important for investors not to just be in the private sector, but also in the public sector.
Interesting.
Sitting inside the public sector, in ministries of innovation, in ministries of technology, balancing that necessary stakeholder interaction and having that ally from within government or within states to actually accomplish something. Let me give you an example. So if you look at countries like Tanzania, Tanzania isn't a country you would think of when you think of the Big Four or Big Five or even Big Ten, necessarily startup ecosystems in Africa. You think of Nigeria or Egypt or Kenya or Ghana or Rwanda or South Africa or maybe Morocco, other countries like that. But what happens in Tanzania is you have a change of government. Suddenly the government puts innovation and technology on the agenda, and suddenly we have a regulatory sandbox, we have talks of capital gains exemptions, you have international investors flowing in, we see an increase of both FDI and direct private sector investment. So a lot is possible, and I think in most African countries, the idea is to make sure that you package enough into investor support infrastructure so that that support infrastructure doesn't necessarily go so far as to help investors, but it doesn't, kind of throw a block on the way. It doesn't prevent investors from investing. So I think in the US or in the UK or in Canada, we talk about how can we move the needle a little bit more to incentivize people to move a bit more from their pensions towards VC or PE. That's a completely different conversation when we talk about African countries. In most African countries, we talk about how can we get pension funds to even notice that the VC space exists, let alone to start investing in the VC space, to start collaborating with that space and to move capital.
Well, I guess even a question as to how much capital those pension funds even have to deploy.
Well, yes, but
and who does it impact? Because I would assume that the large majority of kind of those living in poverty or near poverty are not going to be accessing the benefits of those pension funds.
Well, yes, but I mean, you would imagine that there's not enough money going towards depository funds or pension funds or insurance funds, but actually the volume or the size of them is quite impressive. So there are some funds in East Africa, Central Africa, even or South Africa with multi-billion-dollar portfolios, but those are portfolios of US equities, or those are portfolios of real estate. So those portfolios of the institutional level, they rival the portfolios of a private billionaire. But that shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be the case that an institution is building out its wealth like a ultra high net worth individual. An institution should also think about the societal benefit, and that doesn't mean just investing in mining or in agriculture, but also thinking about tech, because it's been proven multiple times and times again this has an outsized impact on jobs. So imagine if, for example, all across African countries, pension funds actually had a 5% allocation towards the PE or VC space. Suddenly you would create a whole class of African limited partners. African limited partners means that if an African VC fund succeeds, that money stays within the country. It reflows. And then every dollar goes 3, 4, 5 times through the ecosystem, rather than what we see now, where we're creating a lot of VCs, we have a lot of effort towards creating more startups, but then when a startup succeeds, it succeeds abroad. It succeeds in the US, it succeeds in Europe as an African startup. And then where's that money going? Well, it's not necessarily staying in Africa. Or you see funds that are investing in Africa, and that's great, but then their LPs are predominantly not African. So then even if the fund succeeds and the startup succeeds, we're still not 3/3 of the way there. The LP base is still largely not African, and that needs a bit of a change, a bit more pushing from both private and public sector to incentivize catalytic funding, to incentivize perhaps tax exemptions, so that those funds actually stay within Africa. And then you could see, every $10 million fund recycling capital and making $20 million of investments, for example. That would be much more healthy.
Yeah. What's really interesting to me, just as you were saying that, is I like just thinking through kind of, the people I know in Kenya, my family, and so on and so forth. If I think about here in the UK, there is so much buzz around startups, and people are throwing 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 pound checks into startups because they get the benefits of SEIS and EIS and all these sort of tax exemptions here in the UK. In Kenya, like most of my family and sort of that middle class that I would know, the only thing they think about when they think about assets and creating wealth, it's property. Like that's it, right? And in fact,
land probably, right?
Bigger one
and land.
Yeah. So land and property is exactly, but like traditional kind of hard assets or businesses. So they obviously, there's a large entrepreneurial kind of spirit, I think, in these countries for sort of, more sort of shop level and manufacturing level type businesses, but less so for those large impact, large scale technology businesses. So I guess there's also an element of not just educating LPs or those pension funds, as you say, but it's also educating the middle class that, hey, look, this is important for you as business owners. Like empowering technology or empowering companies that build technology that then lead to jobs, etc., just means that you are creating a new strata of middle class, a new strata of wealth within the economy that then, again, to your earlier point, recycles through the whole economy, right? Not just small parts of it. So I think it is, from my perspective, it's sort of a case of almost getting Africa to believe in itself, if I can put it that way, right? Or countries within Africa to believe in themselves, because there is some amazing technology that comes out of Africa and solves real problems as well, right?
I mean, I think it's interesting because you could almost see it as a top and bottom end of the funnel. On one hand, you need to work with institutions because institutions are the ones that provide enough capital for VCs to be there, to be African focused and to deploy mostly in Africa. That's one requirement. On the other hand, you want to train the talent so that these VCs can exist. And on the final end, as you say, you need to train individuals, because if there aren't enough angels or business evangelists or startup supporters or
mentors,
consultants, exactly, sure, you wouldn't even have businesses having that base, for example, financial acumen or the base construction of the business to actually be almost large enough or successful enough to reach a VC or reach a PE fund and actually get that funding. And I think what's quite shocking is, for most people, they think, oh, well, they always talk about the demographics. There's 1 billion plus people in Africa. There's several hundreds of thousands of multimillionaires all across Africa. But for many of them, their assets are locked, as you mentioned, into illiquid assets, such as land or property or general real estate. And it's not necessarily lying around or sitting in bank accounts. Most people don't actually have very large bank account balances.
Well, also because the currency restrictions, all sorts of things, like the risk is massive, right?
Exactly. And so it's not so much that, it's an easy way to tap into the global amount of money flowing back through remittance. So there's an easy way to tap into all these multimillionaires. It's a gradual process. But of course, if we set that gradual process in motion, then you wouldn't see such shocking numbers as how I think there are more than 500,000 active angels in the US, a country of 300 million people, and there's about 1,000 people writing checks across the entire African continent, including both foreigners and African residents. So that disparity, it's a 300x difference, which is crazy. And it's not something that is unsolvable. It just needs a bit of, mindset adjustment.
That's a new startup idea you and I have just come up with there. So why don't we, these remittance companies, you could have an option that 0.025% of your remittance goes towards funding a startup for which you will take equity. That's like probably dollars rather than, hundreds of dollars in a lot of these cases of remittances. And, you could start building up an asset base that way. Anyone who wants to build that with me, I'm right here. Reach me at aarish@emerge1.co.uk. I will pass it on to Mark and see whether we can get that going. But let's talk about Dream VC, right? Because obviously a lot of this stuff is stuff that you are addressing, maybe not directly, but obviously through the work that you're doing, the end goal is obviously that improvement in the overall ecosystem. So why, I mean, like you've just described why you thought this was a gap that you felt you had to plug, but why was a gap that you felt you had to plug in the African market? Where do you see it going? And I guess, you know, I'm sure you've been asked this before, but you know, it's something I always ask of a lot of guests that I have on, that you know, are focused on sort of these emerging markets, but come from European countries or of European descent. Isn't one of the problems that we've had that there are too many Europeans in that ecosystem, right? So, what would it not be more valuable? And I guess this is what you're doing, right? To build that strata again of Africans in the African venture ecosystem.
Sure. Well, I mean, you've kind of perfectly summarized why we're doing what we're doing. So I think there's a very big reason why when people think of Dream VC, they don't necessarily think of myself or my co-founder as the brand name. That's not something that we really put out there. So for us, it's much more important about what our fellows, what we call our trainees, actually go on to do. So we celebrate the success of our community, and we introduced individuals in the community so that when you see a foreigner who is active in Africa, an American, a Canadian, a British person, for example, they're not just a British person in Africa. They're a British person who's part of this African-focused VC community, so who's actually adding value back to that community. So I think the goal for us is to almost bridge that divide that's been created and that's been exacerbated over the last few years, where you tend to see it being foreign funders, potentially foreign recipients of that funding, and then mostly local recipients. You don't see as many African investors yet. So number one, we need to create a much larger number of African investors, and that's what we obviously do. We have our junior program training individuals to become the future analysts or associates who will then actually be the bulwark of the VC talent space. We then have our senior program that trains angels and fund managers and individuals at a more senior level in their career to go out there and actually put their own money to work, put their own time to work. But I think beyond that, it's also just making sure that we don't politicize the fact that foreign involvement is there. I think often we tend to divert away from an issue. It's almost like not touching on something that's too controversial, but say in Kenya, it's a very controversial point. You have a lot of foreign funds investing in foreign founders. But something people forget is that sometimes those foreign funds wouldn't invest in local founders anyway. So you see, for example, an international fund investing in international alumni of an international university.
Who just happen to be
who happen to be in Kenya, which can then touch on the much bigger sentiment that you do see indeed discrimination, where there is a certain trend towards investing in foreign talent, but it's usually not for the reasons people think. One thing we explain, for example, is that quite often you see a lot of funding going towards graduates of top US schools, graduates of HBS, or, for example, some top school like Wharton or Berkeley Haas School of Business in African countries. But there's a reason for that, because often, because they've gone to the US, they've built the social capital.
They've got the
and
alumni
the
network. And
exactly. And it's alumni of Berkeley investing into an alumni of Berkeley who happens to be in Africa, or alumni of Harvard doing the same for Harvard alumni, rather than it being Americans investing in an American.
Yeah, there is a linkage that is direct enough that it takes away the perceived risk, I guess, of investing in a country outside of your country of origin, but even more so in a country where a lot of people would perceive there to be higher risk than, say, investing in a French company, for argument's sake, or something like that.
But to bring it back to your earlier point, so I think the easiest answer I can give of like why we're doing it is because when we started, nobody else was, right? So actually the way we started, as with most people who have a venture building or venture capital background, is we actually went directly to the funds and the startups and we said, what do you think about this? And we actually heard back from some of the earliest fund managers. They said, oh, this is a great idea, but I'm not going to do this. Why would I train other fund managers as a fund manager? I have no incentive. There's no economics for me. I'm just creating competition for myself. And then you reach out to the startups and they say, well, this is great, but I don't have the skill set to teach somebody else. So who does I have to be? Is it the consultant? Is it some kind of intermediary? So we realize there's a bit of a gap where institutions largely want to work on precedent from industry. Institutions want to see somebody who's done that before, who then comes to the institution and teaches the institution how to do it.
And I think that if I'm not mistaken, the guys at like Baobab Network, that's exactly how they set up, right? Like taking institutional knowledge from outside of the African continent, bringing European consultants and bankers and so on, and bringing them in to kind of mentor, consult, and advise. I think startups for the most part, but possibly also funds as well. I'm not sure.
I think it's mostly startup oriented for now, but yes, I mean, to a large extent, yes. But what I'm saying is more so that you don't really see, universities out of Cape Town or Lagos or Nairobi rushing to offer private equity or venture capital courses, partially because the skill set's not there and because the only people who they know to ask are the industry specialists, and the industry specialists don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a certain dearth of, yes, this is a great idea, but I don't want to do it kind of attitude. So when we just sat there, I think it was like a 5 or 6 a.m. conversation.
It's a good old VCs cheering from the sidelines sort of thing.
Yes, yeah. And then myself and my co-founder, we both have been opportunists at heart. So I think we've always, when we see something, we kind of discuss it and say, well, honestly, like, can you do this? Can you change your mindset? Do you care about being focused in Africa for the next foreseeable 10, 20, 50 years? And then we said, well, yes, it seems really excited. We were already African focused at the time, and it seems like nobody else was doing it, but it wasn't so much that somebody was setting up barriers. In fact, we spoke to the angel associations and they said, well, this is something we want to do, we just don't have the time. Mm-hmm. Spoke to the VC funds and they said they don't have the labor to do it. Spoke to the startups, they didn't have the knowledge. So then it seemed like,
okay,
why not?
Well, we can fill that gap.
Yeah, we can fill that gap. And then obviously if it leads other people to do the same thing, then that's actually good, because then that validates that we probably hit something. I think I'd be much more worried if we started off training people and then nobody else was doing it. I'd feel probably like we were doing something wrong.
Yeah.
But actually, it's been very encouraging. So we've been around for 3 years, and we've seen multiple other programs who, well, quite literally emulate the wording. They emulate the same structure. They've asked us for feedback. How do we train people in Tunisia? How do we train people in Uganda? How do we train people in South Africa to get these same outcomes? And sometimes it's organizations that have existed that just noticed this is now possible, let's do it as well. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's organizations that looked at us and got that inspiration. But it doesn't really matter because, as I said, it's such a big market that it's actually healthier that multiple people are doing it, so it's not all reliant on
it's that old thing, right? Like if you haven't got competition, maybe you're doing something wrong. Right?
Yes,
like
exactly, right.
There has to be, if there is demand for what you are offering, then it is only natural that others will come in and fill perceived gaps in your offering, right? And that might be localization, it might be language, it might be, whatever. It might be some sort of a focus that you guys don't provide. But no, look, I think that makes a lot of sense. And look, ultimately, I am, especially where it comes to things like education, and this is a form of education, let's face it, I am really very much all for any form of education that gets out there and provides something different to the status quo, because the status quo isn't serving everyone as well as we needed to. Obviously, in certain countries in Africa, you would hope even that the base level of education improves. But the more you're able to kind of provide that insight, that knowledge, the more it broadens people's perspectives and minds. And even if they don't go into the VC ecosystem directly themselves, hopefully they'll also champion it, right? Hopefully they will still be there.
I mean, I love that you just said that, because actually very few people make that jump, that realization that training people about VC is not necessarily just training them to be a VC. So recall what I mentioned earlier about getting VC evangelists in the public sector, getting VC evangelists in the corporate space. You can't have that by just training VCs and then having the same corporates with the same mentality trying to work with these VCs. It will just be the same scenario as what happened 20 years ago when you started to see this whole push for Africa rising, and then there wasn't the same adoption from the incumbent space, right? So what you need to do is you need to structurally change. You need to see corporates, for example, being engaged in corporate venturing. That's a massive opportunity. I mean, definitely, I'd love anyone who's interested, hit me up. Lots of discussions to be had in terms of what can be done with corporate actually engaging in the corporate
I'll
space.
hook you up with my mate at Standard Chartered.
Absolutely, absolutely. But look, that's one thing. But then on the other hand, you also need to actually see, like, systematically throughout society, people saying, oh, tech is a real thing, even to the point where an African parent, when they're speaking to their kid, they're saying, engineering, healthcare, banking, or another consulting career. And then they say, oh, well, maybe technology is okay. If we even get to that point, you can imagine the meteoric rise of adoption of startups and VC that we'll see. It won't be seen as like a fringe career that is only done by some random foreigners in Africa. Yeah. As currently, I think a lot of people perceive it to be.
If they perceive it at all.
If they even know it exists.
Exactly. Yeah. So just as we close off, I'd love to understand, how can those of us that are sitting here kind of almost on the sidelines, right, in the UK, in Europe, in the US, or beyond for that matter, and you mentioned Southeast Asia and other sort of areas, but how can we educate ourselves better on the ecosystem in Africa or in various pockets of the African continent? And how can we be better champions of what's happening there? I mean, I'm on a bunch of African VC WhatsApp chats, because obviously everything is done on WhatsApp in the VC in the venture ecosystem. And you know, you and the reason you and I even met was because you reached out and included Nothing Ventured very kindly on a list of podcasts that had some focus on Africa. Some would very much more directly focus on the African ecosystem than certainly we are. But you know, we have had some great guests on that do touch on what's happening in Africa, and hopefully we'll have actually quite a few more coming up as well. But how can we become better educated, and how can we support more, I guess, is the question I'd have.
So I think the biggest thing is that everyone is still learning. There is this perception that, oh, maybe private equity knows what's going on, but VC doesn't know what's going on just because it's later stage. But that's really far from the truth. You see new private equity funds come up all the time. And actually quite a lot of the people who are leading the top private equity funds in African markets, they got most of their experience in the US as well, and in Europe and in Asia and somewhere else. You see people in Leapfrog or Helios doing some really interesting things. But even for them, quite often that expertise is bringing something from another market into PE. So it's not so much that there's an incumbent that you need to beat. Everyone's still on their first leg. Easiest example I can give is that, you know, VCs, most of the VCs haven't seen even one 10-year cycle yet, but for African VCs at least.
Yeah.
Now, I think what people can do is, number one, educate yourself. Educating yourself means finding podcasts. If you're lazy enough that you can only listen to a podcast, this is a good start. Nothing Ventured for one, for example, is a good point to actually start getting an idea of what's going on. As you mentioned, we actually put together a podcast list. I think it's the largest one that exists.
270 odd podcasts.
Yes, it's like 270 podcasts specifically with direct exposure to what's going on in the African startup or VC space. So there's no excuse when we give you free material. It's freely available.
And people can find that on dreamvc.com.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? They can just go to dream-vc.com. I'll link it in the show notes, I'm sure. And then they can find a whole list of African podcasts that they can follow. So that's already a given. But even beyond that, so what we're actually focused on, the main work of Dream VC is capacity building, right? It's educating people who want that experience as if you're going through an MBA again, as if you're going through executive education, where you have someone who's a live instructor. You're not just listening to a course online. You have someone physically in front of you, even if it's online or in person, who is speaking to you, just like we're speaking today, answering your questions, tailoring it to your context, using live case studies. And that's everything that we do in all of our programs. Every year we run our programs both at a junior and senior level, and every year we are actually more and more keen to find people outside of just the social circle who already know about Dream VC. So I guess for anyone listening in, look, if you don't know about Dream VC, if you've not heard about us before, that's perfectly fine. So go on our website. We have tons of free resources that you can use even when our programs are not running. Learn more about the ecosystem, learn why we're excited about the ecosystem, listen to podcasts such as this one, where you can actually unpack a bit of what you don't know and perhaps get more questions to ask. And then once you're ready for that immersive experience, then, you know, our arms are open at Dream VC. You can come in for any of our programs and we'll help you go from 0 to 100. And then maybe you'll be the next guest on Nothing Ventured talking about your experience.
I mean, that would be amazing. And you know, if we can again link to, I guess, the program in the notes, that'd be good. I would check it out myself if I have the capacity and the ability to do it. I think, you know, it's something that I would definitely consider. But Mark, this has been an absolutely incredible conversation. Thank you so much. I'm sure we could go into like a ton more stuff, but for the time being, for our audience, where's the best place for them to find you online? You're on LinkedIn or you're on Twitter? Where can they look for you?
So I'm very boring. I just use my full name as my handle everywhere. If you go at Mark Kleyner on LinkedIn or on Twitter, I'm online every day, 365 days a year. So you can always drop me a note or a DM or direct connection request. I think the biggest thing I always tell people, and it's the same advice I give to someone when founders are reaching out to investors or investors to founders, is tell me why you're reaching out. I mean, I think you know what I'm talking about.
I mean, just go and look at my LinkedIn posts of over the last weekend. Yeah.
Yes, it's just reach out, tell me you're interested. And if you're interested, I'm interested in speaking to you. But if you just reach out to me without any context, I have no idea if you're trying to sell me something. Yeah. You're trying to just be friends. Maybe I don't really have time for that. But look, if you actually want to know something about VC, you want to upskill yourself, I will always make time to speak with you. because it's such a pressing need and there's just so much work to be done. It's not even ground zero. We're like 5 floors down in the basement before we even reach ground zero of building the VC space. So I want us to take that step, and we need to take it together. So whoever you are, if you're a foreigner interested in Africa, if you're African interested in Africa, if you've never looked at startups or VC before, but you just want to learn more to understand what the opportunity is, come to us, reach out to me directly, go to the Dream VC website, apply for programs, or don't. Just reach out with questions and we'd be happy to help you.
Amazing. Mark, thank you so much for joining me here in the studio today. It's been absolutely incredible talking all of this through with you.
Thank you for having me.